In today's episode, Aoife and I had a long heart-to-heart about where our autistic journeys have taken us, because we've both worked in the side of things that looks and how happy people are at work for a very long time. In fact, Aoife is the host of a well-known podcast in the HR and people business space called Happier at Work. But she is also someone who is passionately intent on understanding the mechanisms behind her neurodiversity, and also the way that those type of learnings can be translated into the corporate life of neurotypical people, in particular the connection to psychological safety and imposter syndrome, what meaty subjects which I hope we can touch on in following podcasts. But for today, just listen to Aoife's journey, because there's a lot to be understood and a lot to be taken out of it as a lesson. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our new episode discussing the way we survive in the workplace when we are NeuroSpicy. And I wanted to say hello today, and to, as you heard in the intro, we have someone that I have hoped to speak to for quite a while now. We've known each other for a few years, and we have both been fighting for a better workplace in general. So, hi, do you want to say hi to people and kind of do a small introduction yourself, if you like?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Duena. My name is Aoife O'Brien, and like probably a lot of people listening here, I was trying to survive in a corporate workspace, and I left my corporate role in 2018. So I was going to say that was 6 years ago, but actually 7 years ago now, as we're recording this. So it feels like a lifetime ago that I left there. But up to then, I had a pretty successful career for about 20 years doing something I really, really enjoyed. And it got to a point where I just wasn't really enjoying it anymore. So I left there and I set up my business about a year later, while I was also studying for a master's in organizational behavior to understand more about myself and why I wasn't enjoying work. Now, that's kind of evolved a little bit over time, and how I came to know about my neurospiciness was I attended an event to support a friend. She was speaking, I think it was during COVID, she was speaking at an event online, and she started talking about all of these experiences that meant that she was let me think, I think she's a mix. I think she's ADHD, maybe not autism. I think it was just ADHD at that time. And they were talking about all of these different symptoms is the wrong word, but maybe behaviors or experiences that people had. The lived experiences that people had. And I found myself kind of nodding along, but not really putting two and two together, not really thinking. And maybe I think it was about a year after that I started to consider, what if I'm like that as well? What if my brain is a little bit different? And what if that's the reason that I wasn't enjoying work? Or what if that's the reason that I feel a little bit different to other people, let's say? And I started having a look into it. And I guess here we are. When we first connected, I probably had no idea that was the case, and likewise for you as well.
I mean, I had my first diagnosis was in uni, and so I knew I was autistic. I did not know about the ADHD, which evidently makes a big difference. It's only when I landed on AU ADHD that it all made sense, and I had like a second burnout realizing it, which brings me to the question: did you experience any of that? Did you feel any of that? I know that a lot of us that have been firmly diagnosed or have worked it out in our adulthood have this moment of kind of going back and thinking of all the things we didn't have, we didn't know, we didn't go through. And that kind of amounts to this idea of autistic burnout, which is, I'm bullish on reminding our listeners that it is very different than a general work burnout.
And can you explain a little bit more about what it is so I understand? Because I've heard people talking about autistic burnout, but I don't really know.
I don't have the exact definition. I don't know that it is one that is official so far. But I think what it encompasses is a sense of loss, a sense of belonging at the same time, because it's at the same time that we kind of understand we are part of this tribe of other humans that have went through the same types of experiences. But then kind of looking back over your career and thinking of all the adaptation you didn't have can typically result in people feeling quite unpleasant about what they've gone through. And it adds to, obviously, we are burnout in terms of having worked too hard. We all are. I think even people who are neurotypical have went through, the COVID period of insane work. So obviously everyone has a degree of burnout, but the autistic burnout is referring to the realization of the symptoms and characteristics that you've lived through and kind of what that feels like in retro.
Yeah. I don't think I have had that, but I'm wondering, I'm thinking back to my experiences at work and the unpleasant experiences I had at work. And not that that's related to autistic burnout, but more that I was so annoyed with work, generally speaking, that I didn't make the connection, or that it was just a different experience that I had. So like I got to a stage where I didn't feel like I belonged, and I was in the wrong role, and I wasn't being recognized for what I was contributing. But there was all of these different things going on, and I couldn't see myself. When I left, I couldn't see myself looking for another job. I was like, I can't stay in this kind of environment. Although in other environments, I was really happy. And I think that's kind of what led me down the path, that I know that there are environments that create this welcoming, this belonging, this developmental type of approach to work, rather than just here, just kind of get on with it. This is what you have to do. This is what we're paying for you to do. Right. Just get on with it. But when I started kind of looking into the different types of things that might be going on for me, I think I was initially looking at autism. I was like, I think I might be autistic. And so I went through the process of getting a diagnosis. And so you go through this application, you fill out the details, you can share it with a close family member that would have known you as a child, because this is what I understand, that if you're autistic, it's from a young age. It's not something you develop over time. It's something that you've always had. So I went through this process and I shared it with my mum as well. It was quite a vulnerable thing for me to do. So I shared it with my mum, and I had to wait then. I think they said in the application, like, it would probably take about 4 months before we can speak to you. Now, in the end, it took about 6 months before I had an appointment. They booked in the appointment. But the overall experience was just appalling, because actually in front of me, she had someone else's file, and I didn't realize this. As we were going through the process, I thought, these questions seem quite strange. She seems to be letting me kind of ramble and just talk about whatever, which is not related to what I had put on the form to begin with. I'm not sure why she's asking these questions. And then it got to the part about other people's opinions, or, other people's contribution. I said, no, my mum definitely filled out the form for me as well. And she was like, no, I don't have anything here from your mum. So she didn't. And I thought, that's really odd, because she definitely did. And she goes, oh, let me just check something here. And so she checked, and she had the wrong form open the whole time. She had someone else who had filled out the form a week or two prior. I was like, a week or two? Are you kidding me? I've been waiting 6 months for this appointment. So she went away anyway. She's like, give me 10 minutes. I'm going to review this and come back. And so we had maybe a 10-minute conversation about what I had experienced. And the more I talk about it, I can feel a visceral reaction. Now, the more I talk about it, the more annoyed I feel. And that was a good 2 years ago now that happened. And I'm still annoyed. And as we mentioned kind of pre-recording, if that doesn't say that I'm autistic, I don't know what does. But the conclusion was not likely to be autistic, because I traveled the world solo, and an autistic person couldn't possibly be able to do. For everything that I've achieved in my life, an autistic person couldn't possibly be able to do that. Now, they did say, because they kind of included as part of the process an ADHD assessment, which never occurred to me. But the ADHD, she said, you're borderline. So she recommended, this wasn't an assessment. This was like an introductory call to see whether you should go for a full assessment. So she recommended on the autism, believe it, you don't necessarily need to go for a full assessment, because we don't think that you're autistic. And here's the reasons why. And the main thing that I heard was because my mom said that I had traveled the world solo, and, just bullshit reasons, basically, as far as I'm concerned. But the ADHD was kind of an eye-opener. And then I thought, and I've been thinking since then, if I have, and you'll be able to understand or explain a little bit more about this, maybe I presume you know more than I do, but if I have autism and ADHD at the same time, I'm like, do they kind of balance each
I
other
think
out?
it's interesting. Yeah.
So it's really hard
it is
to
really
detect.
difficult. I think a good AU ADHD diagnosis is very hard to come by simply because specialists haven't thought about it in that fashion.
Okay.
In fact, in many countries, they are such separate things. And in particular in Europe, in Spain, for instance, there are one of them is seen as a symptom that's in their version of DMS where all the big illnesses are, and it has a number of characteristics of an actual disability and illness. And the other one is seen as more of a condition, if you wish. So that is very separate. Because they're separate, they've been taught separately to specialists. So when you do encounter specialists, very few that are able to put it together. And it is a new denomination, really. AU-ADHD didn't really exist as a theoretical thing until a few years ago. I mean, just a few years ago, we were diagnosing lots of people as Asperger's, which doesn't even really exist. It's an insane denomination. So I don't know that the labels are accurate or mean anything. To me, once you're on the spectrum and you know you're neurospicy, the way it manifests for you is shaped by life experience, by all of these achievements that shouldn't have happened according to the book. I had the same experience you have. I continuously run into people saying there's no way you're autistic and then kind of denying me any type of adaptation because I've done too well to deserve it. So it's common, but it's also a new diagnosis. So it is entirely possible you're AU-ADHD. I think the way you'll be able to think of it yourself and anyone listening is if you feel like you don't completely fit either of the ADHD profiles, and there are several presentations of ADHD, but you feel like you are relishing structure more, you need more of the repetition. Those are evidently just examples. Your hyperfocus does exist, which counteracts and contradicts your ADHD tendencies. Then when you kind of feel like there are two different parts that pull at each other, that's your more complete profile. It's possible that it's AU-ADHD.
Yeah. I mean, that makes way more sense to me because I can be the ADHD side of things. What I relate to most is the impulsiveness. And I mean that by like shiny object syndrome or getting distracted easily. But I can also go into that hyper focus mode, listening to things on repeat, wanting to eat the same things all the time, having routines, like all of those things that really, really help. I'd love to talk a little bit about masking because I want to understand more about that, like whether I've been masking my entire life and I don't know. And I did see someone post something. I must reach out to her, actually. I saw someone post something recently on LinkedIn saying that she had recently been diagnosed with ADHD. And like, you would just, I think from the outside, you would never know it of anyone. And I'm seeing a lot more of these diagnoses. And I don't know, is it because I'm much more aware of it now?
But also disclosure.
But when I hear the stats.
There's a lot more.
But when I hear the stats that say, what was it, like let's say it's 10%. I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say it's 10%. I'm like, there's way more people in my network than that I'm seeing publicly declaring.
Disclosing,
like, it's not declaring. Publicly disclosing that they have ADHD or autism or whatever it might be. It's mostly ADHD, I think, or AUDHD, but they're sharing about that. But the reason I'm bringing her up in particular is that even though she knows about these things and she works with organizations, she never realized for herself that she was masking the entire time, that she's actually been wearing this mask to conceal how she, and the reason I wanted to talk about that is because we probably don't even realize that we're doing it because we've been doing it from such a young age to try and fit in, to try and be accepted, that you don't actually even know that you're doing it.
Mainly, as I'm sure you're aware, and everyone listening to this knows, it's why females are much, much harder to diagnose, is because we've been so much more adept at masking to be sure we fit in. But and I think it's a really interesting topic, in particular when it comes to the workplace, because you and I have spent a long time understanding the psychology behind the workplace cultures, and one of the main dynamics that we've tried to understand in your case was imposter syndrome. I was thinking of it from the prism of impression management as the opposite of having a psychologically safe culture at work. So we've both kind of really studied that. But if you stop to think about it, at the base of both imposter syndrome and impression management, it's just masking, and it's severe masking so that you
totally.
do not
Yeah.
appear vulnerable, so that you do not place yourself in a position that might be problematic for you at work. So I think the way that it manifests at work, in particular for those of us that have been so diligent to build a career and keep remaining in the workplace and the existing corporate environment,
Yeah.
then the masking becomes a topic of survival. And it also becomes so ingrained. And this is part of, I should have mentioned it earlier, that's part of the autistic burnout, is when you start to drop those masks and assume your genuine identity and you become authentic. That brings about quite an amount of feelings, and it's a really difficult time. You have to kind of reassess and rearrange. Many people complain that they forgot how to do very basic things. They cannot do the things that they were doing with a mask once they've demasked or once they've dropped that mask. In particular, because there's actually, I don't know the exact mechanism, but there's science behind it that explains that we have used the mask in itself to routinize various behaviors. And once that's removed, you genuinely do not know how. You have to learn again how to behave in some situations. So in particular at work, it doesn't surprise me that you felt it so strongly. Those of us that were working in corporate while being autistic have genuinely had to mask a lot more. And let's face it, being a woman, being an immigrant, being anything that is not a healthy white male is requiring masks anyways. And the masking for being autistic and all of these things, because that's kind of where the meat of it is, I think, for us, is to start understanding intersectionality. Because let's face it, no one is just autistic or just ADHD or just a woman or just an immigrant or just queer. We all are all of these things in one, and that kind of exacerbates your challenge in the workplace. So how did you experience masking?
Well, that's kind of what I'm wondering, that maybe I have been and I haven't unmasked yet, that I'm still masking in some way, that, because I haven't experienced that. I haven't experienced the, oh my God, now I have to tell people and now I've forgotten how to do the routine things that I used to be able to do when I had a mask. And that's what makes me so curious about it, about how I show up and how vulnerable and how authentic I can be. And where is that rooted? Is that rooted in 5-year-old Aoife, who was in school and just wanted to have friends and wanted to fit in with people and didn't want to be different and didn't want to stand out? So I suppose for me, I'm still getting to grips with that. And it's definitely worth a bit more exploration after this conversation.
I'm glad to hear that. That's very kind of you to say that. But I think it's important to also be as open and honest with yourself as possible, which is difficult, in particular if you've kind of told yourself you have to have this particular persona. And in our case, I think it's double hard because we are semi-public figures, or at least people are listening to some of the things we're saying. So we're trying to be sure that we are presenting a certain fashion. And there's nothing wrong with attempting to present a certain fashion. But there is that when it becomes wrong, I think, and that's why I said be as honest as you can, is when it gives you pressure, when you feel like you have to offer a certain image and that requires a lot of work. That's a mask that's taxing. Many people don't even necessarily ever unmask because either they can't, or they never get to disclosure, or they don't need to. So it's not mandatory that you drop the mask. Some of the masks we're having are very useful. But equally, like you said, it's incredibly inspiring. If you've remembered this lady that was talking about masking, she was talking about being diagnosed. Every time we encounter someone who is capable of demasking, it is such a shock and such an relatable moment that I think it's absolutely worth figuring it out where you stand on the masking topic.
No, definitely. I'm definitely going to look into it. And just as you were speaking there, like I've always, probably in the last 12 years or so, I got really interested in personal development and personal development books in particular. And I read one that was really interesting. I started reading it a few months ago. I finished it over the Christmas holidays, and it's called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. And the reason I stopped reading it was I read the first one, and the first commitment is all about taking responsibility. And so you can be behaving in an above the line fashion or a below the line fashion. And below the line is attributing blame. And just as I was reading that, I was like, oh my God, that's actually me. and I can't read any further until I get this one right, and until I start recognizing those kinds of behaviors in myself.
That's
So
amazing,
it's
though. Congratulations
yeah.
for
Uh,
thinking that. That's
all of
awesome.
that. Well, all of that to say that I think it's all multifaceted, isn't it? There's loads of these different areas. It's all about building awareness of ourselves and acceptance as well. So it's not just awareness, it's accepting ourselves as we are. It's being able to see ourselves. So like I saw myself and I was like, I'm putting this book down I didn't pick it up until over Christmas. I was like, okay, I'm going to continue reading. And there's 15 commitments in total. And I think the nice thing with how they end the book is that it's not about getting it right all of the time. It's about being on a journey and having that understanding and moving towards the way that you want to be, as opposed to staying in the place where you're like, oh, I'm just going to blame everyone. I'm not going to take responsibility for myself. I'm going to, and there's 15 in total. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but it was solid. And I just thought it was really inspiring. And a really nice way to kind of think about things and to live, whether you're neurospicy or whether you're not neurospicy. But I think particularly relatable as someone who's
I think
neurospicy.
it's really interesting that I think there's, I don't have a lot of data, but I believe there's something to be said about the need for self-improvement and the continuous work that many neurospicy people put in themselves, partly because we, it kind of stands to reason we feel so different from the rest of everyone that we attempt to continuously work on ourselves to make ourselves just like neurotypical people. And obviously that's not desiderata necessarily or something to aspire to, but it also kind of explains why we've had this mechanism of ever trying to achieve more and demonstrate that we are equally capable as and that's why you'll find loads of autistic people that are very high achieving. You're going to find a lot of ADHD people that have burned themselves out tremendously by being a perfectionist and attempting to get themselves better at every corner. That's kind of all part of the same package. And then obviously you have, and I want to address that, I want to say that not everyone joyfully acknowledges and embraces their new identity as neurospicy, and it's not mandatory that they do. And we have to acknowledge that there's loads and loads of people that are not very happy to find out that they are on the spectrum. To them there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of conviction. And then we have to admit that then in the workforce it is still incredibly dangerous to be disclosing. So in the sense of, if your goal is to maintain your very hard-earned built persona with the masks that you need so that you function well in an enterprise, and in today's world where kind of employment is so hard to come about, in particular for the areas where more autistic people are working, such as technology, such as science, and so on, it compounds. So that fear keeps people from disclosure and from feeling at ease with discussing these types of bits and pieces. So the fact that you're working really hard on yourself is amazing. It's unfortunately for people not a luxury that everyone has. And I'm always careful to say that you and I can do that because we are, we are the masters of our own destiny, whereas that's not the case for someone deep in the belly of a corporate entity. So it's much harder for some people.
Yeah. I think there's loads to unpack there. Firstly, I'll say that hit deep when you were saying about the achievement thing and like this drive to improve ourselves and this drive to constantly achieve and how we burn out by doing that. I also wanted to say that I've never experienced actual burnout, but I know when I'm about to get there. I know when I'm about to kind of cross the line, let's say, and that's when I want to do more. It's like, I want to do more. I want to keep going. No, there's one more thing. I just have to, and it's this inner drive to keep going at all costs, no matter how tired I feel, no matter, what else is going on. I just have this inner drive to kind of keep going. And then the third element is around this being in the corporate belly of, I can't tell my coworkers who I am or how I am. I'm seeing that start to change a little bit, and it's inspiring to see. And you've inspired me now to see if there's someone in my network who is at quite a senior level within a corporate organization, but who has been diagnosed as neurospicy later in life, but with a strong career background. And now publicly sharing that in the workplace to show that it doesn't
Right.
mean anything. It's a
This,
it's a
this is the
label,
point
and
of
it doesn't have to
this show
hold
is
you back
supposed
in
to
your
be exactly
career.
that. The people that have that we
Yeah.
hear more experiences. And if you look back over the episodes, most of the people that have come on the show, like us, have been diagnosed late in life and they've gone through the same experiences. But I think this, what you're describing, this sense of achievement and of trying is common. That said, then really quickly, not to interrupt you, I would challenge you to look in your network and anyone listening to this for leaders that are starting to disclose all of a sudden, because unfortunately I think we have very few and we need a lot more of those. I wasn't going to announce this just yet, but since we're discussing it, we're working on a sticker project that's attempting to make that visibility a lot easier and a lot more common inside organizations. People who you do have as employees can break that stigma internally by showing up as leaders and putting their hands up and saying, in fact, this is me.
This is it. Yeah. And that's exactly it. And I think I'd gotten to the end of my point, really. It's really just this inspiration of who are those leaders out there who are talking about this, who are in organizations who haven't experienced the, I don't belong here, I'm not succeeding, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, what's wrong with me, and then leaving the corporate world altogether, especially, and dare we make generalizations here, like women over 40 years old who are late diagnosed as neurodiverse, but they don't realize that when they're still working. They just get to a stage where, like, this is not working for me anymore and I don't know why it's not working, I'm out of here. And then go and set up their own business.
I think we're missing a lot of statistics, and this is because obviously it's a new conversation for society to have. God knows we should have had it ages ago, but unfortunately science wasn't bright enough to diagnose everyone and keep everyone adapted at the same time and whatnot. Because it's a new thing, I think it's super interesting to think of it in the vein of what does it mean for people who are already in the workplace, and what does it mean for people who are entering the workplace, and for new generations that we are now building. And I think it's a lot cleaner from that perspective for new people who have, there are other challenges. They need a lot more and different adaptation than people who are already in the workplace. But the experience of people who have already been, like you say, and like we said earlier, masking for a lengthy period of times, finding either experiencing burnout or, like you well pointed out, finding themselves at the point of nearly getting there, and then employing a gazillion strategies to keep themselves on the brink of it, which is what many of us have done. So that experience of an existence in the corporate world that was a lot harder than it should have been, although I'm sure, and I'd like to say it's super hard for neurotypical people as well to be in organizations, simply because organizations these days are very sick and they need a lot of work to be cleaner as a culture. But it's
they're not set up for humans.
Made for people in general, much less are they made for neurodiverse people. But I think that trauma, if you wish, workplace trauma that we have went through is massive. And like you've pointed out, the statistics are not there. We don't know. But feeling-wise and empirically, yes. Second part of one's life when you feel like authenticity is the case. And I don't know if anyone listening to this remembers there was this lady 3 or 4 years ago in a meme who was talking about, sorry for the French, but this podcast allows swearing, the fucks she no longer gives. And then there was the biggest one was, I don't care about Birkenstocks. It's over. Like, I don't care what people are wearing on their feet. I'm done. So as she was going through the facts that are no longer given, that is the state in which many people have found out that they're autistic, and that kind of conflated to, right, it's time to be my authentic self, and you cannot do that in a corporate environment. So that's why many people have had to leave. But I would also kind of urge everyone to think of the statistics of how many NeuroSpicy people are solo entrepreneurs, are freelancers, you would see them now be digital nomads. That's something I'd like us to touch on. And I think forging this different path for themselves has been very necessary for them to kind of keep being performant. But the plus of it is that we're going towards an economy where that's going to be extremely more common than it's ever been. So that's the good news for us NeuroSpicy people, is that it's going to be the case. But equally, we cannot leave the enterprise in a situation where let's pretend that these people that are still experiencing trauma don't exist, and let's not talk about them. That's not possible. Every workplace should be smart enough to do something about a better environment for disclosure and people having the safety to talk about it.
When I spoke on my podcast, one of my guests from a couple of years ago, like, my impression, and this is not NeuroSpicy specific, it's really general toxic workplaces or just shitty workplaces in general. Like, my whole attitude is, if there's no one working there, then they're just going to sink and they're not going, the company will go under. They have to have people in order to carry out the roles. And like, how to fix that problem is to get people, educate people, show them there's another way and get them the hell out of there. But the challenge back to me then from my guest was, but if there's no one there, then there's no one there to fix what's going on. And what we need to have is advocates in the workplace to fix these things for those people. And taking that attitude and applying it then to NeuroSpicy, what you need is for people who are NeuroSpicy to stay in those organizations and to not leave, and to advocate and to show what can be done and what can be achieved and what accommodations, and that everyone is bloody different anyway. So it's not a generalization of, oh, all autistic people need this. It's very unique to each people's individual needs. And I know that, both you and I talk about needs at work as well.
I mean, again, this episode is between two people who are not only NeuroSpicy, but we have spent 10, 15 years studying workplace dynamics and trying to understand what's broken in the corporate and non-corporate world, and what is under the idea of culture, and how do we make good behaviors? How do we create psychologically safe teams? How do we make sure that people are high performing? But having studied all that, it was for both of us, I suspect, a very separate exercise from putting it in context of what type of neurodiverse makeup people would be having at the same time. I think if we are to overlay the two somehow, I don't know how we would ever, because I suspect the data is never going to be there, we would see a lot of commonality between places that are in tension and places that are not that healthy and they don't have a generative workplace culture. And that will have a correlation with the amount of people that were neurodiverse and had to keep it under wraps, with the amount of people that were neurodiverse. And there are other implications, actually. We don't have the time for it today, but the more neurodiverse people you have, most likely you have a lot more acceptance of canaries in a mind that are actually putting their hands up and saying, well, no, I see something here that's wrong. So there's an element of,
that's not right. They're more likely to speak up. There's an element of
having a lot more whistleblowers internally and people who do fight for their enterprise. And I think it's exceptionally important that organizations understand that the talent that they have internally, who is already neurodiverse, they should find out which one it is, because it is likely to be some of the strongest human element that they have. People that are super invested in their job, people that are super invested in seeing the bigger picture, in seeing it work. They're not afraid to put themselves out there. They don't have the same exact attitude to failure that sometimes neurotypical people have. So I think, there's a lot in the profile of autistic people that workplaces should be thankful for. And going back to what you said, unfortunately, we are nowhere near having disclosure at the if you have a board of 10 people in the board, 3 or 4 of them are likely NeuroSpicy, and you don't hear that ever, other than this one token dude that's supposed to be their chief of neurospiciness that goes to conferences and says it's okay to be autistic. Yeah. You cannot have that, just this one token person, and pretend we're all fine, because what is needed is a lot more openness to then harness this amazing amount of talent that they have in NeuroSpicy people. Yeah.
But I mean, not different to neurotypical as well, being able to harness that potential that every single person has. And we could probably talk about this stuff. But I mean, the other thing I wanted to say is that there could be people listening, much like I had no idea that it opened my eyes listening to other people, what they were talking about and the behaviors that they demonstrated and the things that they experienced in their lives. So there could be people listening who are maybe like, oh, I don't know, that's interesting. But then questioning, oh, actually, that could be me. So there's probably tons and tons of people working and masking and compensating in some way, but they just have no idea that their brain just works differently.
I say this a lot. It's people are not seeing the value in disclosing. When the fear and the risk is so great, it doesn't feel like there's any point in doing so, even if they know in their hearts of hearts while they're doom scrolling, this is about me, this is me. But then they don't see the value, because that would just bring about problems. But I say this a lot, admitting to yourself that you are neurodiverse when you are neurodiverse is one of the biggest acts of self-care you can ever do, because it does change your life perspective. It is transformational in a way that's hard to put into words unless you experience it, because having this in the back of your mind as compared to having it recognized by your own self and then finding a sense of belonging with other people that are like you is different from night to day in terms of capability to go through life. It's not going to magically do anything. We're not going to all of a sudden be more socially adept, or we're not going to find it easier to deal with rejection. We're not going to need less justice in the world, but we will find it slightly, it will be a lot different of a context for your soul really to be in once you admit it to yourself. And again, I understand overall disclosure at work, I would not advise it unless you are a leader, and then you have the absolute duty to start talking about being diverse, I would say.
Yeah, to be a role
because
model.
there's so many people out there that should be listening and understanding that there are ways to look at it that are not as restrictive as they've been told. I mean, there are many places on earth where autistic people are not seen as employable. They are not believed to be good candidates for various roles, when in fact those roles have been filled by autistic people all along. So, but we don't talk.
But they just didn't realize. Yeah.
Right. It's a big topic, but I'd like to have you back so that we chat about it some more. I know that there's a lot in your journey that needs dissecting, but the one thing before we close, I would like you to speak about is how do you find and what do you think is the connection to being a digital nomad? Is that something that you kind of, I know you've chose it intentionally, but do you think fits better with the profile of someone who's neurospicy?
That's a really good question, and it's not a connection I had made necessarily previously, and especially when I think that the fact that they're telling me I couldn't possibly be autistic because I traveled the world, and now you're saying, is there a connection between these two things? Maybe there is. I haven't particularly noticed. I haven't analysed it. You know, I've got quite an analytical brain. I haven't looked into it in any great detail, but to me it would also make an awful lot of sense because you're not fitting the standard mold of how we should do work. It's kind of challenging the status quo. It's getting out of that old boring routine if that's what people are not into. I personally like having routine and doing the same sort of stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean I want to stay in the same place to do it. So that's kind of my thoughts on. I haven't seen a particular connection, but it would make a whole lot of sense.
I think anyone that wants to listen to more, I'll put the link to your podcast at the end of this video. If you're seeing it on YouTube, if you're only listening to it, search on any podcasting platforms for Happy at Work, and you're going to kind of listen to a lot of episodes where it's not about neurodiversity, but just kind of the workplace and the way that we are going through this. But a lot of your journey is part of those episodes. So go ahead and listen to more, please, because it's transformation. And thank you so much for coming over today. I'd like to have you back again, and that we dissect this situation we've all been through and this long life of being neurospicy that we've had before us. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for such an insightful discussion.